Howdy, y'all. Welcome to the Kentuckian. Glad that you've joined us for this episode. We're told often directly or indirectly to just trust the government. Is that really always the most wise choice? Well, this isn't necessarily to address that question directly, but I did want to talk about some programs or projects that the government has had that aren't really talked about very much and give you just a brief breakdown on them. And we'll let you decide for yourself. However, of course, we know that the government would never tell a lie. So, just keep that in mind as we go along. Before we get into these interesting subjects, albeit dark subjects, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, that like button, comment down below. YouTube's algorithms are killer, and those sorts of actions really help. If you also might want to, go over to the Rumble channel and subscribe there and help me build up some steam on that program. Anyway, let's get into the content. The first thing I want to talk about is Operation Northwoods. Probably haven't heard of this, but it was a program from the middle of the Cold War. So picture America in 1962. It's the height of the Cold War. Nuclear destruction seems almost imminent at times, and 90 miles off the coast of Florida sits a tiny little hotbed of communist aggression, Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis would happen in October of 1962 of the same year, and it's arguably the point at which we were closest to nuclear war. So Cuba was a big problem. It was something a lot of people were worried about, understandably so. They were worried that the Cubans might do something, but especially that their allies, the Soviets, might use Cuba as a staging area for some sort of attack or other nefarious purposes. Well, one solution to the Cuba problem that was almost implemented was Operation Northwoods. It was a plan by the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are basically the guys in the charge of the branches of the military, very rough kind of understanding there. It was planned by them to implement a number of false flag operations, and that's basically, in case you're not familiar, where just for example, say Germany did something in France and made it look like Switzerland did it. That's what a false flag operation is. That's just for illustration. And it would be a number of false flag operations that would be attacks on U.S. property and U.S. soil and other sorts of things to justify military intervention or an invasion of Cuba. Now, already that's problematic, but it gets worse. So, the documents that were eventually declassified, which interestingly enough were declassified during an investigation on John F. Kennedy's assassination, many years after his assassination. Don't know what that means per se, but I thought it was interesting to bring up. So the document that was declassified, it was a sort of a source document. It was, hey, this is what we think we should do. Here's some general ideas. If we can get the go-ahead on this, if we can get the sign-off, then we will make a proper timed out plan with exact dates and times and details. But it listed out a lot of things that they believe should be implemented, and they just needed to go ahead to continue the planning phase, basically. So this included, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it included blowing up U.S. ships in Guantanamo Bay. It included staging and highly publicizing funerals of fake victims for blowing up a drone ship, as they put it, an unmanned ship, and making it look like it was the Cubans. Remember, all this was done by the U.S. government, presumably the CIA. They kind of indicated it should be done by one agency and mentioned the CIA, if I remember correctly, in the documents. But they would stage and publicize these funerals, actually even mentioning a Remember the Maine incident, which, if you're not familiar, was sort of a calling card and rallying point for the Spanish-American War when the Maine was destroyed. Believed, at least claimed, that it was the Spanish government that did it in Cuba, by the way, and justified the war. But Operation Northwoods would try and implement similar things to get people riled up to justify an invasion of Cuba. They would stage the shooting down of civilian or military aircraft, and there's some detail even in the kind of outline that they listed out. They also talked about a, quote, communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. And you should see also a picture of that exact section from the documents that were released. There were also going to be attacks on the U.S. base in Guantanamo Bay, so not just naval ships, but the actual base that's there, what might be called Gitmo today. But that whole area, there's a big prison there now. I don't know if there was in the past, but there is now at least. And many other options that they had listed out. This was not one guy with a crazy idea. Let me be clear. It was developed by a large number of people in the Department of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff helped write this document. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was basically the guy in charge of the military under the Secretary of Defense and the president, signed off on it. It was presented at least to the Secretary of Defense directly, but Kennedy shut it down. Although some of that is unclear, his decision shut down the possibility to implement Operation Northwoods, even if he didn't know about it directly, and it's not exactly clear if he did or not, but they had kind of suggested we could use force to justify an invasion or some things like that. A lot of that record keeping is kind of unclear, and Kennedy just shut down anything like that. It's a very dark thing. It's very interesting to read through, and actually it's a very easy one to read through compared to a lot of government documents because it's only about 15 pages, and a lot of the pages don't have a lot on them. Some of them get a little more in depth. Maybe that's something that you all would like for me to go into detail on in a video at a different time. If you would, put that down in the comments below. But that's Operation Northwoods, a proposed plan that got to the very top, and it was to conduct attacks on American and other places in order to justify an invasion of Cuba that would include harming or killing U.S. civilians, as far as I can tell. And sometimes they act like they're trying to minimize or eliminate civilian casualties and make it look like there were civilian casualties or military casualties. Other times it seems like it's just wide open and people might or might not be killed. Maybe not specifically targeted, but they might be killed in the process because they are literally terrorist attacks conducted by the government made to look like Cuba. Very dark and interesting thing. And then the other program that I wanted to talk about was MK Ultra. Now, MK Ultra is something that you might have heard of. Maybe maybe in spy movies, different things like that. But it's no secret, actually. It was a CIA program to develop mind control and other alteration techniques. And from what we know about it, it mostly used drugs to do this. I'm not making this up. It's not a conspiracy or anything like that, conspiracy theory or anything like that. It's a matter of public record. Actually, a lot of the documents were released under a Freedom of Information Act request, and there was actually an official investigation, a Senate hearing done in 1977 that you can go, and I actually was looking at it in research for the episode, looking at a official Senate hearing on MK Ultra. And the more I study it, the crazier it gets. So let me kind of break down what MK Ultra was. The program started, as far as we know, in the early 50s. It was known to use a lot of drugs, some investigation into hypnosis as well, although that didn't seem to be a focus, but sort of a side project maybe. The experiments that were conducted with MK Ultra to develop mind control and mind alteration mainly used drugs, as I mentioned, and they were tested on a very, very large number of people. Most of these people that were tested, that had drugs given to them and all sorts of things like that, were unknowingly given these things or unwilling or both in the program. Military members that were used as test subjects were told that they would be court-martialed if they spoke about what had happened to them, about them being tested. Another example of some of the ways they tested, the CIA actually set up brothels in their safe houses, in some of their safe houses in San Francisco, with one-way mirrors and cameras to take advantage of the men that came to the brothels to test the drugs on them and to see the reactions. CIA agents were given drugs with no warning. I even read about one particular instance of sometimes like LSD being put into their coffee, their morning coffee, and them not knowing it. One in particular who had it put into his morning coffee, and basically there was a whole huge thing through the rest of the day, and he actually ended up dying later, if I remember right, but I'd need to double check that. And there were people that died from these drug tests as well. Regular civilians were tested under similar circumstances. They were either coerced or tested unknowingly, without their consent, without proper information. And it is also known that while it was drugs in general that were used a lot, a large amount of the testing revolved around LSD. So the drugs that were being given in a large number of the cases was LSD, which is a very powerful psychoactive drug, very powerful and very dangerous. And they were trying to see what they could do with it. A lot of the goals, and we think about mind control as just being able to tell someone to do something and they do it without question. That was part of it. That was actually a significant part of it, but they were also trying to see what the effects of these drugs would be and how they could be manipulated to get what they wanted, how they could be used in interrogation as well. but even things like, trying to change people's allegiances, and it was wild, the kind of stuff that they experimented with. This also included foreign experimentation where they could build detention camps outside of the U.S. and capture or get suspected sympathizers, suspected agents for the Soviet Union or different things like that, and test on them, torture them, and interrogate them to try and get information as they might have been agents. It's wild. Like I said a minute ago, the more I dig into it, the crazier it gets. The drug usage and the testing was also mixed with a lot of torture and other experiments as well. It's not just the drugs and seeing how the drugs affect them. There was a lot of stimulus and all sorts of torture and mental manipulation methods that were used to try and see what results could be produced. And as I stated before, as you might can tell, this was all bad in and of itself. There would be a messed up program even if most of the testing was voluntary. But most of the testing wasn't voluntary, and that makes it that much more worse. And most of it was done on Americans too. It wasn't they had POWs or that sort of thing, which again would still be really bad. But it was actually conducted on Americans against their will and or unknowingly. Again, this is a matter of public record. This isn't some crazy conspiracy theory guy. One guy claimed that it happened. The interesting and perhaps even scariest part about it is that we really don't know the scale of the project and everything that was involved. And the reason for that is in 1973, the documents on MK Ultra that were in the government, in government archives or wherever, were ordered to be destroyed by the then current director of the CIA. But due to a misfiling of a significant number of documents, there was actually a large number of documents that were eventually declassified a few years later under a Freedom of Information Act request that discovered these documents. They were basically put in the wrong building, if I understand correctly, and they escaped the destruction. So unfortunately, and while there was a Senate hearing into what was known, unfortunately, we'll probably never know, but we definitely don't know for the moment the extent of everything that was done in MK Ultra and just how bad it was, exactly what was experimented on. We know a portion of it, but other than that, we really just don't know. And what we know is bad enough. So there are fairly extensive documents available on it, which again maybe would indicate or require more in-depth study in a video. I'm certainly going to keep looking into it more as I go along. But as we close, and this was supposed to be a shorter informational video, I did want to consider for just a second, why would something, or how could something like this happen? Like, this is not unheard of. Here's two examples from the 60s and 70s, basically, a slightly larger time scale than that, of really extreme stuff happening. That was 50, 60 years ago. Of course, you could question what could happen now, what happened before that. Those are definitely legitimate questions. But how would the government even get to that point? Well, remember that tyrants desire power and control. And the people that were doing these things were not stupid. They may have been dark, they may have been evil, they may have done horrible things, but they were not stupid. And it's really the same story of history. People desire power, people desire control, and they do really messed up stuff to try and get it sometimes. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case with a lot of programs in the government, even recent ones that we've heard about that I've talked about before, and we can go into detail in a different episode. But this was both informational and hopefully helpful to you, give you something to think about, something to chew on, and maybe, at the very least, a little bit of interesting table conversation. Hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Hope that you found it interesting and helpful, as I mentioned, and hope that you'll consider supporting the Kentuckian. If you like what we do here, don't forget our social media that are posted down in the description of this video. And if you'd like to support me in a more personal way in what I'm trying to do, my Patreon is also listed in the description below. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. It's been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.